Ben, I think I've made a blunder this week.
What are you talking about?
I mean, for this full disclosure, so obviously we broadcast the episodes live, and therefore we know roughly what we're going to talk about before we start any show. There's a certain amount of planning and thought that goes into it, very, very roughly. Sometimes more roughly than others, as we'll discover this week. And therefore, when we schedule the live stream and everything else, we have to come up with a title for the episode before we've done it, which is unusual. And I've got to be honest, the title Short-Lived Sensations for this episode, it fits thematically, but I thought about it a little bit longer after I scheduled the stream and everything, and I thought episode 4 of a very, very new podcast, which we hope will run forever and ever and ever and ever and ever.
Of course. Yeah.
To call the 4th episode of your podcast "Short-Lived Sensations," I sincerely hope that doesn't come back to bite us one day.
Well, Jack, it's an incredible coincidence because Short-Lived Sensation was actually my nickname in high school.
Nonsense! Look at you now. Look at you now. Look at where you ended up.
Still alive.
Oh dear. Well, yeah, no, you're still here. I'm still here. We're still here. It's episode 4 of the Security Hazard Show, and you know what? Let's get started. Welcome, everyone. Episode 4 of the Security Hazard Show. It's a Gerry Anderson themed podcast where we talk about all sorts of things Gerry Anderson related to sort of vaguely relevant French cinema, to episode reviews, to everything in between. I'm Jack Knoll. I am joined as ever by Ben Wolf-Page. Hello, sir. How are you today?
Hello, Jack Knoll. You're hitting all of my nicknames in high school with vaguely relevant.
If someone had called me vaguely relevant in high school, I would have taken that as a compliment, I think.
Oh, yeah, would have been overjoyed, yeah.
Yeah.
Even for a bit of vague relevance, that would be a step in
the right I would take that in a heartbeat. I would love to be vaguely relevant in anything that I do. Goodness me. Yes. So today, talking of vaguely relevant and short-lived sensations, we've got a sort of 2-part episode today. We're going to start by talking about some of the lesser-seen characters in the Gerry Anderson universe, because it's something of a common theme, and it makes sense. Gerry Anderson had a very long career making lots and lots of different TV shows, and in amongst those TV shows, there are often characters who appear to start off with, and then over the course of a few episodes, they disappear. And the reasons for those disappearances are many and varied. And conversely, you also have characters who start small and end up becoming more prominent as well. So we may get around to talking about those. So we're covering every Gerry Anderson show, and we're just going to kind of have a little conversation about that. And then later on, again, speaking of short-lived sensations, I'm really owning that title. Now that I've come up with it, I'm sticking with it.
Yes.
So
just lean into it.
We're going to be talking about the Secret Service, and specifically, we're going to be exploring what might have been if the series had gone past its relatively short run of 13 episodes, what that might have looked like both on screen, but also behind the scenes at Century 21, how that would have possibly changed the shape of Gerry and Sylvia's trajectory, the effect it might have had on UFO, and everything that happened in the 1970s with the Andersons' career. So lots to dive into there. But first of all, we're talking about lesser...
This is our widest ranging episode.
We're trying to cover a lot of ground today, so we need to kind of get started. And I'm going to start by we put out on social media asking people what sort of lesser spotted characters did they want to highlight for us, and we had a fair few comments. So I wanted to kind of read out some of those. I've got my Lady Penelope notebook ready with my notes written down, so I'm going to kind of get us started. The character that came up the most often, which to be honest I hadn't really thought about, was John Tracy.
John Tracy, interesting.
Now, the reason why
I didn't think of John Tracy either.
No, I didn't think of John Tracy for the fundamental reason that he does appear in 24 out of the 32 Thunderbirds episodes. Wow, so to say he's a lesser seen, sort of forgotten character is kind of I don't know. It doesn't quite fit the parameter for me. I understand why people kind of would
he's
that.
In those episodes, but very briefly in just about every occurrence.
Right. His role is
a lot of screen time.
His role is very, very firmly established as well. He picks up the distress call, and then once that part of the episode is done, he's out. For the most part, there are a few exceptions to that rule. Danger at Ocean Deep is an obvious one where he actually does get to go out on a mission. Atlantic Inferno sees him kind of appear throughout the story, kind of giving continuous updates. That possibly has to do with the fact that Jeff isn't there, so it kind of changes the balance of where the dialogue flows within a standard sort of Thunderbirds episode. So yeah, there's a lot to be said. But of course, the argument that everyone likes to bring up is, well, the reason John Tracy didn't appear very much is because Gerry Anderson hated him.
Right.
And indeed, you know, Gerry Anderson has told that story of, I didn't like John because he was ugly, or I didn't see anything in the character, and things like that. And it's an argument that people will repeat back as like, well, that's the reason. That's kind of the set course. Ben, what do you make of that? The creator of a show saying they don't like one of their own characters.
I don't know, because it seems like things were very flexible at the beginning of Thunderbirds. You know, like with I'm thinking specifically of Alan having the wrong voice because Matt Zimmerman hadn't been cast yet when they were doing Trapped in the Sky, and because of the format changes in there, they obviously had a lot of freedom to do different things. Right. So I think if Gerry had come along and been like, I really hate that character, they could have recast him. They could have redone the puppet, substituted a different puppet. So it seems strange that he's adamant about his hatred for John in later years.
Yeah.
But at the time that they were under the gun and under pressure, that John seemed to suit just fine.
That's the key.
Yeah.
I think that for one thing, you look at Trapped in the Sky, written by Gerry and Sylvia Anderson, and you go, well, John's role in that episode is set from there. Like, that's the role he plays throughout the series. Trapped in the Sky is a fairly typical appearance for John. The way it's written, the amount of screen time he has, everything. It's sort of very standard. So it doesn't really diminish from there too much, and in some cases it increases. So, as you say, if they had wanted to change something at that stage, which the more we learn about Trapped in the Sky, the more it becomes apparent they were working on it and tweaking on it right the way through. If Gerry had felt there was a major issue with one of these characters, then something would have been done about it.
Should have been addressed.
Yeah, exactly. Now, what I think where that story comes from, where Gerry will say in an interview, oh, I hated John, I think it comes from a place of people pointing out a potential flaw in the way the show is written, of saying, well, you've got 5 main characters here, but one of them is conspicuously absent. I think he was trying to cover himself, really, in that way.
Just kind of justifying that decision to leave him up.
Yeah, I think so, which is why it sort of feels like a story that was come up with later. He probably got asked that question so many times, and the honest reason is, well, the reason he's up on the space station, the reason why he doesn't feature in sort of the rest of the show is because that was his job. That was the character's function, and it's a function he performs very, very well, very effectively. And it's always exciting, that moment when we pan up to Thunderbird 5 and John's there ready to take the call. That's always...
Oh, it was for me, absolutely.
It's a moment where you're like, okay, now the story's getting started. John's the first member of International Rescue in uniform, in situ, in a Thunderbird craft that we see in Trapped in the Sky. So, I don't buy the idea that Gerry... I don't buy the idea that Gerry purposefully said, right, please stop writing for John. I think it was just a natural evolution of the series.
The way that they're telling the story. Let me ask you this as a follow-up question then. Do you feel like John bears a resemblance physically and vocally to any particular character in Stingray?
I mean, certainly vocally, it's very similar to Lieutenant Fisher. Because obviously Ray Barrett voiced both characters, and it's sort of a voice that he was clearly quite comfortable with. Physically resembling, not so much. No, I wouldn't have said that. No.
Okay. Because in the DVD commentary for Stingray, Gerry mentions having a similar dislike to Lieutenant Fisher, which is interesting because Lieutenant Fisher plays a more prominent role in Stingray in a way. I mean, he's more present
later on. He's
not so far away as John is, but he's there in the same way that John is a part of the show. It's a puzzling dislike. Maybe it was just a vocal
it could have been, but again, Gerry was the producer. He could have turned around and said, Ray, all your other voices are brilliant. Could you please not do that one again? So
he would have been directing some of those sessions, we presume, based on
at the very least he would have been in the room, I would have thought. But no, I don't know. Again, I think that might have been trying to cover his tracks a little bit. Like, there's a reason, trying to come up with a reason why this character was underutilized, perhaps. Because there is a lot of potential in characters like John and Lieutenant Fisher.
Absolutely.
And that's what I think people get frustrated by when they watch the show, is like, we could have had more John. There was capacity there, but with the way the show was structured at the time, it just made more sense not to use him. But I like him. I'll keep him around. But that's so I wouldn't say he was sort of one of those forgotten characters. One of the ones that other people called out in Captain Scarlet, specifically the original Captain Scarlet series, although it also applies to the new Captain Scarlet as well, is basically 3 out of the 5 Angel pilots. In the case of the original series, that would be Harmony, Rhapsody, and Melody. And in new Captain Scarlet, it's Symphony, Rhapsody, and is it Melody? Yeah, Melody as well. Basically, you've got 5 Angel pilots, but only 2 of them can really have much screen time.
Yeah, it's a real... I kind of agree with that comment, because it's a real missed opportunity, and everyone is quick to take credit for having female characters being, fighter pilots, and the kind of pro-women approach that they took by doing that. But then as characters themselves, they don't get used to their full potential. They're kind of interchangeable in a way in terms of their functions in the story.
A little bit.
Have a lot of character that
the only thing that
drive the narrative very much.
Unfortunately, the only thing that sort of ends up defining any of the Angel characters is their relations to the men, i.e. Symphony Angel the reason why she gets more prominence later on is because Captain Blue has a thing for her, and so that
right.
But
Yeah, and
that
it's
naturally
unfortunate
makes
because
them more. It makes them more. It does make them more interesting. It's just unfortunate that that's the thing that ends up defining them as characters.
yeah,
Yeah.
it would have been great to have a story that focused just on the angels having to
Yeah.
solve a mystery or
Well, in
something.
New Captain Scarlet, we do get that with Fallen
We,
Angels. Fantastic episode. Really, really good episode. Yeah. So
thank goodness for new Captain Scarlet.
yeah, but I mean,
Fighting
the good thing is that in the original series, at least each angel does get a spotlight of some description. It's not necessarily fantastic, but Melody gets to kind of lead the group in Seek and Destroy. Harmony gets a bit more to do in the launching. Not very much more, but a bit more to do. And then Rhapsody gets a nice sequence in Attack on Cloud Base,
right.
which is all a dream, but which is a dream being had by Symphony, of course. So it points to a sort of interesting problem that occurs in a lot of Anderson series, which is you have big ensemble casts,
right?
And
that's
it
sort of
means
that in this whole discussion, isn't it? There's just so many characters that even if you were to give a character a lot of screen time, it has to be shared proportionally with the rest of the cast.
Right.
And the casts are gigantic.
Yeah. It's a very, I think, quite a more of a feature film way of thinking, in that you have your stars, and then there are obviously other characters who perform functions, and it's kind of set that, well, those are just the characters who aren't in the film as much. When you get to a TV series, and you have all this potential, all this time that you could fill with lots and lots of different characters, it's interesting that the decision is then made, well, we're not going to do that. Those characters will remain as side characters. Some of them will disappear completely. So I think that was very much the thinking that was going on, of like, well, if this was a feature film, you wouldn't really care that half your characters are in the background. But when you come to do a TV series, it's kind of, you get familiar with the patterns of the structure of the cast and things like that, and you think, oh, this is not really kind of changing or developing or anything.
Yeah, and it could have been a real shot in the arm for shows as they were kind of getting later in the production run, and they're starting to feel a bit more samey, perhaps, or getting stuck and coming up with ideas in the writer's room. It could have reached into some of these, side characters and developed them a bit more and done something interesting, and potentially found some really interesting conflicts within the group to develop.
Yeah. But of course, the problem there is New Captain Scarlet definitely does do that. I think that part of the problem would have been because the broadcast order of the series was totally different to the production order in a lot of cases, and the team were very much aware that the shows were going to be shown out of order. So any character development that happens sort of happens more by accident than by design. And also it means that they could also get away with characters disappearing and reappearing and stuff like that, because again, the show is going to be out of order, so it doesn't really matter whether people disappear a lot, because they probably will show
Captain
up.
Scarlet in particular, because there are narrative arcs in Captain Scarlet, where you have your Lunarville trilogy, you have your kind of sequence of events with discovering that the Mysterons have this relationship to X-rays and the Mysteron gun and so forth, so that you can't really watch it in any order. I mean, you can,
you could
but
try.
It doesn't make as much sense.
Yeah.
They definitely were trying to do something more as they were writing Captain Scarlet. Tony Barwick, in particular, being the script editor, I think.
Yeah. Definitely.
Some opportunities missed there.
Yeah, definitely. Another quick example that was brought up by Simpsons Clips 24 on Blue Sky, of course, talking about Lavender Castle, because we know Simpsons Clips 24 loves Lavender Castle, but he called out a couple of villainous characters in there, the Dank and Colonel Clump. I'm not sure how familiar you are with those, but basically they are a couple of characters who had sort of spotlight episodes as major villains. And then at the end of the series, there's a clip show, and those kind of events and those characters do come back. And I do think they're fantastic, very vivid, very bright, colorful, interesting characters, interesting villains that could have recurred had they made more episodes of it. Had there been a second series, and that would have been an interesting direction to go in. Because Lavender Castle loves its recurring villains and having the baddies turn up multiple times. So yeah, definitely those could have been a couple
lots
more.
Of potential there. Lots to explore. Lavender Castle, if explore that.
Yeah, another one that of course comes up a lot is just UFO, just in general.
Yeah, that's kind of an elephant in the room. You want to talk about UFO?
Let's talk about UFO, because my goodness me, the cast changes in that one a lot. And I think for me, that comes back to, I honestly think there was some sort of issue with the way that actors were contracted for that show. Just the fact that they had the freedom to come and go as they please. I mean, when you look at the other, well, I compare it to the other ITC live action filmed series. None of them have a cast as huge as UFO. UFO has so many recurring characters compared to, I mean, it's on a soap opera level as far as the number of regular people who are supposed to turn up in every episode, but obviously don't. But because this is a series being that's filmed and it's, higher budget and things like that, it makes sense that there are certain actors who were probably contracted. Look, they were probably contracted on an episode by episode basis, and so if they weren't needed, they were gone.
As a means of keeping the costs down,
probably,
presumably.
Yeah, I assume so, because just because the series had such a, and again, it's like if UFO was a single feature film, you could get away with the people on the submarine just being the people on the submarine. But because they appear in a few recurring episodes, characters like, Peter Carlin turn up in 6 episodes, you go, okay, well, that's a recurring regular character then. So when they suddenly disappear, you do just feel like, what's going on here? Like, it just hadn't quite been thought about, it seems.
I wonder if it was kind of a naivete of the producers not having been working with puppets for so long and not having done, having done a couple of live action feature films, but not having done a live action series running for so long, if they just kind of felt like, well, because it wouldn't have been a bad paycheck doing an episode of UFO for an actor at that time. It would have been a pretty well-paying gig as these gigs would go. So I imagine they felt like, well, people will probably come back and do more when we ask them, not realizing that actors sort of have to take work as it comes. That it's sort of a first come, first serve kind of business. So if you're contracted, for 2 weeks, and then someone offers you something for the following 2 weeks, you're going to take, whatever comes up first, most likely, unless it's, unless there's some real leverage there. So it, then you get yourself in this position where you might want to do more UFO, but you're already booked. So it's a real tricky proposition, and it could be down to that inexperience of not having done that much long running.
And I think they do learn that lesson as UFO goes on. You do start to notice, okay, the cast has shrunk. There are fewer sort of cuts away to what's going on Skydiver this week. Or if it is, it's like very much a focus of the episode, So I think there was a certain amount of learning how to make a fairly long running TV show with actors and the limitations of that and how you need to structure your stories rather than this sort of like I think about the episode Identified obviously as like a first episode. It sets everything up. So it's this shotgun approach of like, let's have a quick look at everyone in the show. But then that same approach is applied on Computer Affair and Flight Bar and all the future episodes that follow. But then you start to realize those characters are dropping off or changing or something is going on. And so it just, the structure of the show just doesn't function in that way. Yeah.
Yeah. You don't get a chance to really get to know them as you would perhaps like to, which is a shame. Yeah. They definitely learned their lesson from that when you go into the Protectors, where it's a smaller group of recurring characters. There's really only the 3 or 4 or 5 if you count Chino, I guess.
Yeah, who disappears after the first series, I believe.
True.
Yeah,
and then in Space 1999, you know, those actors who were supporting players, Prentice Hancock, Xenia Merton, they all had contracts to keep them in place.
There was a comfortable awareness of, okay, this is how you cast a TV show. You have your main characters, and then you do have your sub characters who might contribute in some way to the episodes, but it's usually in a sort of meaningful, pointed direction.
The debate UFO versus Space 1999 comes up fairly frequently. And for me, it's always Space 1999, basically just for that reason, because the cast is consistent and you have time to get to know all those characters consistently. Whereas UFO, it's the premise of it supposed to be a secret organization that requires a lot of training to be a part of. You have to be committed to be part of a top secret organization. And then the characters just kind of come and go. There's a revolving door. And it makes no sense.
Yeah, like particularly the
premise.
Like the episode Confetti Check AOK in the flashback, they make quite a big point about we are selecting the best possible people to be there. And I look around and I'm like, oh, there's Jeremy Wilkin. He doesn't really appear very much in the series, but apparently he was one of the very carefully selected people. You know, it's things like that. It just doesn't quite mesh together. But obviously, they do have the benefit of the fact it's a show with a military premise, and there would be rotating crews on the like things like Skydiver. You would have different people appearing. And again, with the show being broadcast out of order, maybe that stuff wasn't so noticeable as the thing went out. I'm not sure, but
obviously you and I don't have the context of knowing what it was like to watch it as it was originally coming out.
Yeah. And the fact that you have the opening titles, I think, do a good job of sort of deceiving you into thinking that certain characters are around for longer than they are. Like Alec Freeman is always there. Gabriel Drake as Lieutenant Ellis is featured prominently in the opening titles, but she's actually only in 10 episodes of the whole show.
That breaks my brain a little bit.
Exactly.
She was only in 10. You think of her as like sort of the iconic commander of Moonbase, but not in.
Speaking of the commander of Moonbase, I mean, there's the whole story on UFO about what's the character's name? Commander Desica, who was written into the first episode to be the Moonbase commander. The actor got fired before the episode was even finished. And that's how Gabriel Drake ended up with the job as Moonbase commander in the first place. So there you go. You've got a forgotten character who never even made it to the screen. Kind of baffling. Again, quite a baffling way of doing things. But I mean, I suppose at least, as I say, you didn't end up with one episode where it was like, this is the commander of Moonbase, and then they were never seen again. But that role then ends up becoming quite weirdly played out as Captain Foster then Colonel Foster gets introduced into it.
Foster is another sort of Achilles heel of UFO for me, because he's set up as being the new boy, and he's sort of like he's sort of the character the audience is supposed to identify with in a way.
Yeah.
Where he's dropped into this top secret world, and they sort of set him up as like, oh, well, he can kind of like, you think, oh, he can be the one who explains to us, they can explain to him as they're explaining to the audience the things that we need to know.
Yeah.
That they wouldn't necessarily say to each other. The kind of exposition that you need to tell a science fiction story.
Yes. Yes.
But then he almost immediately goes to this position of trust where he's in charge of, the moon base sometimes. Yeah. Sometimes he goes out and in charge of ground operations in the Moonmobile. Sometimes he's down in skydiving.
Ground operations. Meaning go and see this lady and,
Yeah. It's all
get
over the place,
information out of it. Yeah.
It feels like they didn't really have a firm grasp when they started writing what he was going to become.
Well, he suddenly just needed to.
For that.
Yeah, he just suddenly needed to fulfill a function. Yeah, it's a frustrating sort of potential character arc that they could have done. It was sort of right there in front of them. Like, you could have an interesting bit of growth there. But no, instead, he just is immediately dropped into a very functional position, which also ends up being at odds with Alec Freeman's role, which obviously that then gets dropped, gets replaced with
that was sort of
Colonel Lake.
Sort of a key piece of information there is that allegedly Alec wasn't very popular with the American branch of ITV or ITC.
Oh, right.
So they thought, oh, what is this guy doing here? He doesn't seem like he fits, and they were pushing to get rid of him, which is why that second in command role changed allegedly.
Okay. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, it's just bizarre. Just they never quite. One of those things where they started making the show before they realized what the show was.
Yeah,
but there you go.
And also, a lot of the production team talk about the sets being fixed, as opposed to they were sort of permanent sets. Things like the Shadow HQ set were permanent, so they weren't taken down and put back up. They had no flexibility to go out on location or to build guest sets because they didn't have enough stage space. So all kinds of problems with UFO. But I don't want to sit here and rag on UFO.
We will, I'm sure, do that another time because I do quite like it. So that, we'll let's save that one for another show. I just want to run through a few more characters who never sort of got to reach their appeal, got to reach their potential. I mean, we've got to talk about Officer Beazle in Space Precinct, haven't we?
Let's talk about Officer Beazle.
He's probably the most extraordinary example of a character who is there 1 minute and then suddenly isn't. We know the story behind that. Ben, do you want to tell it, or do you want me to share this one?
I think you better tell it because it's fresh in your mind.
So yes, it is.
Talk about it now.
Of course. I'm going to be reviewing Space Precinct on the Security Hazard blog, but that's by the by. But specifically, we want to talk about Officer Beazle, who is a character in Space Precinct who is a partner of Officer Orin, played by that chap. Can't remember his name. Orin, Space Precinct. Who is he? I don't know. Anyway, so Officer Beazle was originally his partner in the series, a Creon police officer. Regular, kind of down-to-earth guy, kind of the comic relief, just sort of good at his job, but not anything special, just kind of standard issue police officer. Played by the actor Tom Watt, who had kind of achieved quite a lot of prominence by appearing in EastEnders. And of all the actors who are playing masked characters in that show, Tom Watt was definitely one of the more recognizable, certainly, a little bit of a household name. So he, I think, was already put off by the fact he was wearing a mask through the whole thing. But it wasn't until episode 4 of the series that the production or the team working on the show learned that most of the alien characters were being dubbed and revoiced by other actors. So, in the case of lovely Richard James, who of course played Officer Oren, I'm just pretending, was revoiced by another character, but revoiced by another actor. Tom Watt was also revoiced by Gary Martin, who was already on the show voicing Slow-Mo. And Tom Watt basically turned around and said, well, if my face isn't going to be seen, I think pretty much the only thing that was exposed to the air on any of those Kreon characters was their tongues. That was the only part of them that you could actually see. And if you think then, okay, from that tongue is a different voice coming out. So there was no part of that character anymore that was recognizable as Tom Watt. And therefore, he walked off the show, had his contract terminated there, and then actually isn't credited on any of those first 4 episodes either. He's completely, it's like he was never there, basically.
Amazing.
And then next week, Officer Beazle is gone and replaced by Officer Romek, played by Lou Hirsch. And that partnership of Romek and Oren is kind of solidified. But what I find so funny, and you'll find this out when I come to review the Space Precinct episodes on the blog, the references that are made to how close of a partnership Beazle and Oren have. I think it's talked about in Double Duty that they've been partners for 7 years. They're really close. They're a really tight-knit pairing. So wouldn't it be odd if one of them suddenly disappeared off the show? In terms of what impact it actually has, not much, to be honest, but it is just a very surprising case of a character who just completely disappears.
It's odd because Romek and Beazle are so kind of similar to me as a viewer.
Right.
I struggle to think of distinguishing characteristics as far as telling them apart. They come so close to fulfilling the same role in the story, and you could easily transfer the dialogue. They don't substantially feel like different characters at times. The other part of that story that strikes me is it's weird to think about. It's weird in 2 ways. One, it's weird that they would go to the trouble to cast someone who was a little bit more well-known.
Right.
And then not even bother to tell them that they would be revoiced. That didn't enter the conversation.
Certainly the fact that the revoicing happened in the way that it is. The story goes that it was, they really wanted American voices for the show. And that even people like Rob Youngblood, who obviously were Americans working on the cast, were part of the process of listening to actors' voices and going, yeah, they've got the right voice for it, and no, they haven't.
Right.
Now, I wonder whether at first Tom Watt because there's another side to it of maybe Tom Watt having been in EastEnders for so long and playing quite a recognizable character. A bit before my time, so I can't say I particularly remember who that character is, but I know it was quite a celebrated character. Sorry, EastEnders fans. I just, I can confidently say I probably know more about EastEnders than Ben does.
That's definitely true. Never watched an episode of EastEnders.
Never ever. Wow, that's incredible. Anyway, write that down for the podcast. No, but he may have been looking for a little bit of anonymity, maybe.
Sure.
But possibly the revoicing was just a push too far, perhaps. I don't know.
Hard to say. It's an interesting thing with accents too, where to native ears, an accent to someone like Rob Youngblood, an accent that would have been passable on British TV probably would sound different to him being a native.
Right. Because Richard James said, we were playing it, they were doing American voices on the set.
They knew.
Yeah. That was the requirement. But you think, well, why would you then cast those actors only to then, revoice them later?
Yeah, it's a bit
with voices that are almost, particularly someone like Gary Martin, was so, what's the word? not over the
It's a
top,
very, but it's a very
heightened.
specific. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. That's the word. Yeah.
And so it sounds like it's being dubbed.
Yeah.
But anyway,
The
I will
other
get
part of
into
that
all of that when it comes to Space Precinct.
Yes, I look forward to hearing about it in great detail.
Yeah.
The other part of that story is that's weird to me as someone who's interested in puppetry is the amount of work that you can do to create a character without voice, without your face being seen, just by gesture and movement alone is huge. And I think you see that particularly in Richard James's performance as Orin.
Mm.
You know, it, it would have been difficult to just slot some other person into that part because he created a walk for that character and mannerisms for that character that become part of who Orin is.
Yeah.
And that's to me, I would think that would be an interesting challenge for an actor to, think about like the Mandalorian or like the Godzilla monster suit. Like someone wore that suit and created the character. What an opportunity as an actor to create a character without all of the tools that actors normally rely on.
Yeah.
It's almost
yeah.
like,
but you have you also have your career to think about. You have your, am I going to get any future work off the back of, sweating inside of this suit for, best part of the year?
I totally understand. People get into acting for all kinds of reasons, and finding, exploring that particular frontier of acting I can understand why that wouldn't necessarily appeal to every actor.
Yeah.
A lot of
Well,
actors would
particularly if you've just come off the set of EastEnders, you're probably thinking, well,
it's quite
there are easier ways to make my living. Possibly. Not that I'm saying EastEnders is easy by any means. It is incredibly difficult work that, doesn't get enough credit. But it's a different type of work, and if you're interested in that, then fair enough. If you're not, then you're not. But the thing that actually, just one last thing about Beazle, you talk about actors, the fact that Richard James really was physically Orin, and you can't really imagine anyone else being physically in that role. I'm surprised, given they were only 4 episodes into Space Precinct and they were revoicing the character anyway, why they didn't just recast Beazle. I would have thought they would think we can get away with just putting someone else in the suit.
Right.
But is it because those masks were so carefully fitted to the faces underneath? Maybe they couldn't have recast it. I don't know, but
yeah. Well, in Chris Dale's new documentary, which is on the Space Precinct Blu-ray set, that there's a lot of footage, and I think this footage has surfaced elsewhere. But there's a lot of footage of the process of making the masks for the leading characters, and they show an actor going into the process. I can't remember which actor it is.
It was Rob Thurtle for one of the guest characters. Okay. Yeah, I think I know the footage you're talking about. It was in the original.
Yeah, you see them getting a life cast made of their face. So it's you can definitely I can definitely see why that might have been a possibility, that they were like, well, this can't just be adapted to fit someone else. It's personally
exactly. Yeah. But it's just funny how quickly then the turnaround was of, right, we've got to make a whole new character to fit this scene, and they do, and it works pretty well. And I like it.
I guess what do you think was the point of them having been partners for so long? Was it supposed to contrast with
I mean, it's to be honest, that line in Double Duty, I think, is mostly just there to evoke sympathy in that particular moment, because Orin has been injured and he's lying on the table, and so we're supposed to feel like, oh, we need to feel something for this character, who, of course, it's the first episode, so we've only just met them. But so they put that bit of backstory in there, probably not really thinking about it. But also, I mean, as the show, even those first 4 episodes go on, it's very clear that they are a double act, and they are closely knit, and they work very closely together, and they work well together. So I think that was probably part of it as well. And as you say, it contrasts nicely with Brogan and Haldane being the newbies to the show, I guess, or newbies to the precinct anyway. So yeah. Yeah, very interesting stuff. A couple of other lesser seen characters from the Anderson shows that I wanted to run by very, very quickly. I don't think there's too much to say about some of these, but Oink from Stingray.
Oink.
Doesn't get a whole lot to do.
Oink.
Fulfills that furry creature remit that had been established with characters like Mitch the Monkey in Supercar and Zuni the Lazoon in Fireball XL5. For some reason, they felt the same thing was needed in Stingray before they quickly realized there's nothing we can do with this animal because the only thing it can say is oink, and it can barely move as a puppet. It sticks out for how limited it is compared to what else is going on in the show.
Yeah, it's very limited. It's kind of there's something about its eyes that aren't quite right. It doesn't have the like kind of Mitch and Zuni both have kind of large eyes to kind of give them a more friendly appearance to varying degrees of success.
Yeah.
Oink has very like small beady yellow eyes that don't give him the appealing appearance. I could see potentially like there's a moment in I think it's Sea of Oil where they Oink saves them from a mine.
Right, that's his first appearance.
In his first appearance there, and it's like, oh, well, you could have had something, an animal sidekick in Stingray, sure, but the way the way the show developed with I think Stingray has some of the strongest characters of any of the Supermarionation shows, and that it just didn't need.
It wasn't needed.
That narrative,
not at all. Not at all.
Yeah.
Yeah,
which is kind of a shame, but I'm not sure that Oink is an interesting one because he's not really successful. Some of these characters like Beazle is like pretty successful as a character, I think.
Yeah,
but they just didn't have room for him, or like the actor didn't want it out, so they had to swap it in. Oink just like straight up doesn't work, and I think that's most people agree that it was the right decision to leave him out.
Yeah, I think it's what is noteworthy. I think I'm right in saying this is that his only major appearances are all in episodes that were written by Dennis Spooner. Does not appear in any of the Alan Fennell episodes. So I wonder if that was a factor as well. Maybe one writer favored the character while others did not. So that could be a part of it as well.
This could be.
Captain Grey from Captain Scarlet, he disappears because Paul Maxwell, who voiced him, also famously voiced Colonel Zodiac in Fireball XL5, he disappeared. So Captain Grey still appears in the background of scenes, but he never speaks again. And so the story goes, he was supposed to be quite a prominent character in the show. He was sort of after the core pairing of Scarlet and Blue, Captain Grey probably would have been the next one down. That ends up being a role filled by Captain Ochre, Captain Magenta, that sort of thing. So Captain Grey disappears.
Well, you just have so much with Colonel White and Lieutenant Green. They kind of filled that space of being right under in terms of screen time, right behind Captain Blue and Captain Red and Scarlet.
Yeah, exactly. Captain Red.
That's what my nephew calls him. He's like, "Can we watch Captain Red?"
And you say, no, you need to learn.
No, obviously I just absorb his mispronunciations.
Yeah, of course. A couple of other one interesting one that stands out is Tim from Terrorhawks, the little health checkup thing that Dr. Nightline wears on his wrist. What became of him? Not a lot, really. He's in a couple of episodes at the start.
He's mainly featured in Gold, which is an episode where they deal with the premise of Tiger being a clone. The only episode they deal with Tiger being a clone, really, where he dies and has to be replaced by one of his clones. So in that context, his role in the show would have been very important because he would have obviously been part of that process of
He's
Tiger
explaining
transitioning
to the
from
audience really what's happening as far as like
right,
his Einstein's health is concerned.
right. But
Which
Einstein's health didn't play much of a role in the rest of the series.
right.
They sort of that aspect moves further and further to the back burner as the show
Yeah.
goes along, and thus, what function does Tim serve? It's interesting because they set up other stuff early in the show too about like miniaturization,
Yeah.
things like Zelda's ships being able to get small, which obviously a small character like Tim could have been part of a story about that, but
Yeah.
it's just left by the wayside.
Just ideas thrown out there. I think the thing about Tim is if he had only appeared in that one episode in Gold, then you would have just written that off as okay, that was just a device for that episode. It's the fact that he also turns up in Thunder Roar.
That's right.
It's kind of like okay, like they're trying to make this a thing.
We're trying to do more. Yeah.
Yeah, because it's an interesting, particularly for 1983. It's an interesting device, a piece of technology. You know, it's and obviously a great precursor to all the Fitbits and that sort of thing that people wear on their person now to do exactly that function. Exactly.
Watch
So
Tim.
Kind of,
and I love the voice
interesting
that Robbie Stevens gives it as well.
Yeah,
it's really nice.
It's probably when you consider you've got Hudson, you've got the Zeroids. It's probably just one virtual assistant too many, I guess. In the show.
Yeah,
that's probably the
Terrahawks
issue.
is definitely one of those shows that it's like we're just going to throw everything and the kitchen sink into this formula and see what sticks. I mean, they just threw everything at it.
Yeah.
It has like every aspect of every previous Gerry Anderson production thrown into a blender, and what comes out is Terrahawks.
What comes out comes out. All right, one last one. I've saved probably the juiciest for last because we alluded to it in our Trapped in the Sky review.
We sure did. That's probably what kicked us off on this whole journey, was talking about this character in Trapped in the Sky.
Let's talk about Kirano. Let's get into it. I'm shutting my book. Let's go. Because Kirano's a really interesting character just because of the sheer potential of storytelling that could have happened there. Where it's a traitor in the midst of international rescue itself. That is a loaded gun that they do nothing with at all.
It is. There's a concept in drama called Chekhov's rifle, from a play written by a playwright called Chekhov, who put a rifle on the mantelpiece at the beginning of a scene, so that in a prominent place, so the audience can see it, and they know subconsciously something's going to happen with the rifle by the end of the play. And Kirano is definitely that, where they set him up in a big way to be really important. Only there's no fulfillment. The
series
either
just
turns out to be. Yeah,
sorry,
go
ahead.
Don't play it off. They don't play it off as a a reversal in any way. Like, it's not like, oh, you were expecting this to happen, but it didn't. It's just quietly dropped, just like most of these characters we've been talking about.
Well, it's weird because it doesn't escalate at all. They just do the same thing again and again. Like, Martian invasion, same thing happens where the Hood will get Kirano in his power, have him do something, like give away a secret, or in that case, mess with the automatic camera detector. And then they'll just do the same thing again a few episodes later, and Desperate Intruder, same story happens. There's no escalation with it. And Jeff Tracy and the other characters at the end will always be concerned for Kirano, but it doesn't overtake the story. No. So eventually the writers probably just realized we can't keep doing the same thing because it will stick out like a sore thumb, but they couldn't think of anything else to do because they were so busy doing other things with the show. So many other characters to develop, so much more exciting stories to tell that would function better in that episodic format. Kirano could have been an arc that went across the whole series, but instead, because of the nature of the show, they couldn't really do that effectively.
They couldn't do that,
so
yeah.
they just had to drop it, which makes you wonder, well, why
It's
did
too
they
bad.
introduce it in the first place?
Yeah, I wonder if there was a plan made ever for Kirano to do something else besides that, because it, as you say, it's such an intriguing premise to have
Yeah.
a traitor in their midst, and it could have been a lot.
But it would have been so dark for that show as well.
Yeah, totally. Perhaps a bit of a very different tone,
and very, not necessarily action driven either. You wouldn't have had a big action
Yeah,
set
it would
piece and all
be.
it. It's more psychological drama.
Yeah, which I mean, it works really well when they try to do that. I'm thinking particularly of an episode called Marineville Trader of Stingray,
Right.
where they try to do a traitor in our midst story, and they it's it has its faults, that episode, for sure, but it does a good job of building suspense.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, you do definitely get to a point watching Marineville Traitor thinking, you know what, Commander Shaw could be the traitor here. Like, this could be for real.
Right. I don't think I ever thought that, but
okay, well, fair enough.
There's
just me being naive, I suppose. Yeah.
No, I'm sure a lot of people, agree with you.
Right.
Yeah, it's just they could have done a lot more with the characters than they did, perhaps.
Yeah.
Out of I don't know, maybe a fear that the puppets wouldn't hold up if they tried to do more psychological drama. That they just felt like they didn't have the expressiveness to communicate.
I just don't think it was within. I just don't think it was within the remit of the show. It's just not what fun. It's not what you watch Thunderbirds for. You watch it for the big explosions and the rescues and what are the Tracy brothers up to and the heroism that goes into it. Lady Penelope just managed to get enough of the spotlight so that you could also do some interesting things with her on the sort of espionage and intrigue side of it. There just, even in a 50-minute format, there just wasn't enough room to also have this family psychological drama going on with Kirano at the same time as well.
I wonder if there had been a single episode that was kind of a Kirano focused story to kind of explore that arc.
But the problem with that would have been you still would have had to either write the character out. Basically that could only go a few ways. Either somehow, I don't know how they would have done it, everything would have had to reset back to zero at the end of the episode, where somehow, even if it had been explored in more detail, Kirano still would have been able to keep working International Rescue. The Hood would have still been the villain of the piece. Still, those two would have still been connected. Or you would have had to drop. It would have been an episode produced for the sole purpose of dropping that element entirely, where either you write Kirano out, you disconnect the link between the Hood and Kirano somehow, which again I think would be too abstract of a concept to be explored in a satisfying enough way in an episode of Thunderbirds. Or you would have had to drop the Hood completely, which of course they end up doing,
which happened anyway.
Yeah. So all in all, just an odd thing to happen.
It's just an odd thing. It's an odd thing. Yeah, completely. I think as a viewer, I would have been interested to see them wrap that up in a way. Perhaps in the Christmas episode, because the Christmas episode feels a bit lacking in elements. That would have been a place to put it.
I'm not sure mental torture and family betrayal is necessarily the theme you want to run with in your Christmas special. I could be wrong about that.
I mean, that's what my holidays. That's what my holidays are like, Jack. Those are all the themes of the Page family.
I'm kidding. Never spend Christmas with you. Well, with all that being said, I think with that lovely image, it's time for us to. We talked about all our characters who are short-lived sensation. Now, let's talk about a specific show. We're going to talk about everything that might have been with the Secret Service. And I'm going to play in our lovely little intro right now.
To everything that might have been. To everything that was.
Everything that might have been. This is a new segment of the show where we talk about Gerry Anderson productions that maybe didn't get to their full potential. Maybe avenues and alleyways that could have been explored further but never were. And today we're going to talk about the Secret Service, which, if you're not familiar, was the final Supermarionation TV series that was produced, broadcast to a very limited audience in 1969. It only ran to 13 episodes, whereas the previous Supermarionation series had all been sort of 30, 32, 39, a much more significant chunk of episodes. Secret Service only ran to 13 episodes, and after that, the puppet stages at Century 21 Studios closed. There were no more, Supermarionation puppet productions, at least made there with that team at that time. And Gerry and Sylvia went on to work on UFO and the live action productions and the declarations that were made over the course of the 1970s. So the Secret Service is interesting for many, many, many reasons. First of all, Ben, I should ask you, what's your overall take on the Secret Service? Love it, hate it, indifferent to it? What do you think?
I love the Secret Service. It is one of my favorite Gerry Anderson shows. I just adore the humor of it, the bizarreness of it, the weird attempt to harmonize live action with puppetry.
Yeah.
It's all like a guilty pleasure for me. I adore it.
Yeah.
What about you?
I adore it as well. Obviously, if you head to the Security Hazard blog, securityhazard.net, I reviewed every episode of the Secret Service in quite a lot of detail because it is a fascinating specimen, both in terms of its production, but also as a TV show. It is so entertaining. And the way in which it finds its groove and figures out what it is, again, like so many Gerry Anderson shows, they figure out where they're going just as the show goes on. The thing that sticks out about the Secret Service is arguably they figured out where it was and then didn't make any more episodes. And that's one important distinction. So first of all, let's talk about the established the story that gets told around the Secret Service and why it only lasted for 13 episodes. So the story goes that Gerry Anderson took the first episode of the Secret Service to Lou Grade, who had obviously financed, was basically an owner of Century 21 Films and was, financing the whole show, and took it to Lou Grade, screened the first episode, and halfway through, Lou Grade said, stop showing, stop the screening, no more of this. This is ridiculous. His specific complaint was nobody will understand Stanley Unwin's gobbledygook in the US. And Ben's dropping in and out of the stream, which is very interesting here. He's here. What was I going to say?
I'm here.
Lou Grade.
You were talking about specifically the language.
Yes. So Stanley Unwin, nobody will understand him in America. Cancel the show. Don't make any more episodes. And of course, everyone goes, silly Lou Grade didn't understand the reason why Stanley Unwin was cast in the first place was because of the gobbledygook. That was a whole aspect of the show.
You're not supposed to understand it.
Not supposed to understand it. And the the language that is used here is really important. People will say, oh, the Secret Service was cancelled. They finished up the episodes that were in production, and then that was it. I would argue for a slightly different phrasing of it. Of the Secret Service wasn't cancelled, it was just never renewed. Many of the Supermarionation shows were made in these blocks of so many episodes. Supercar was made in a block of 26 episodes, and then a second series was renewed for 13 episodes. I believe
almost
something similar
by 13. Do you know why that
exactly?
is?
Because 13 is a quarter of a year. If you're talking in terms of weeks, 13 is a quarter of a year, so makes it easy to sell on television. Basically, there's a quarter of a year of your schedule that's taken up there. So yeah, Supercar had it. I think Stingray to a lesser extent. I believe there was a production gap in between episodes 26 and 27. Obviously, Thunderbirds ran for 26 and then had an additional 6 planted on the end. No one quite knows why it was 6, but yeah, there we go. That's what was going on there. Yeah, that's a whole other issue. So the Secret Service was commissioned, and that's worth pointing out. The funding for the Secret Service didn't just turn up overnight. Like, someone at ATV, even if it wasn't Lou Grade necessarily, said, yes, we will pay you for 13 episodes of this show. And therefore, that's what got produced. The decision that Lou Grade might have then taken is, let's not make any more of these. Let's not commission another 13 episodes. But I don't think there was any thought that the Secret Service was suddenly stopped in its tracks. It was, the remit was for 13 episodes. That's what they produced. Now, towards the end of those 13 episodes, Century 21 might have been aware that they weren't going to make any more. And that possibly, some might argue, is the reason why it goes so off the rails when you get to episodes like More Haste, Less Speed. Was that they just didn't care anymore. Again, I would argue slightly differently. I would say that was more of a, no, they knew exactly what they were making at that point. They realized that the premise of the show was absolutely ridiculous. And so just leaned into it. That's how I've always interpreted More Haste, Less Speed anyway, is, they were suddenly aware of the fact that the live action puppet combination was not something that you could just accept. It was something that could almost be highlighted as a point of comedy and a point of bizarreness, and that could therefore fuel a different type of storytelling to what we arguably got in so many of the previous Supermarionation series.
I feel like I've mentioned this before, but I feel like the Secret Service is a kind of result of a groundswell that was happening in British comedy, where you had things like The Goon Show that were sort of like, it's sort of like a bomb goes off in British comedy. And all these, like, this new wave, this new generation of talent is entering the world of entertainment. And this whole new approach to comedy with, like, absurdism and just, like, all sorts of, like, wacky, I mean, almost anything goes. Things like At Last, the 1948 show. What would eventually kind of culminate in the early 70s with stuff like Monty Python's Flying Circus. I mean, just like real experimental comedy. And the Secret Service could have neatly fit into that mold, where it could have, it could have been part of that movement. And it, by the time you get to the end of it, it basically is that. I mean, it's basically, it's basically on par with something that, like, Spike Milligan would do. It's basically a Spike Milligan sketch.
But in doing so, pretty far removed from what had gone on previously with Supermarionation.
Right, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing, because the part of Gerry's story that he always tells is that by that time he was drowning in his own product. And what he meant by that was that he'd produced so many puppet shows that were all kind of similar, and they were all none of these shows stopped being rerun in the
Exactly.
60s. They were all on the air even after they ended. They were getting repeated. So he was basically making new products, but there was already a deluge of
there was less and less demand for it because, well,
right, because there was a bunch of it on TV. But
Yeah.
there was in the late 60s when the Secret Service was being made, there was a real demand for new wave British comedy.
Yeah.
Which
Yeah.
Eventually translated into a huge success in America on public television when that launched in 1970. Monty Python was a huge success on public television. So
Yeah.
I can imagine an alternate reality where the Secret Service, they had decided to market that differently. And
Right.
if they made more of them, if they brought in more of that young talent to write for Stanley Unwin, if they had created this kind of like alternate comedy thing that would have been different from the other shows. It wouldn't have needed to compete with Thunderbirds because it would have presented itself as a completely different genre.
Totally different audience. Not necessarily a kids show. Yeah. The problem with that is, or the reason why it didn't happen is, number one, Century 21 Films at that point was so set. They had the factory set up of, this is the type of show that we produce. This is our brand. This is what we do. We tell futuristic stories with the most advanced puppets you've ever seen on television. That's what we do. So anything outside of that doesn't feel, understandably, doesn't feel right. The other issue is that the Secret Service, in a way, did start out in a more conventional Gerry Anderson way. You take an episode like A Case for the Bishop, and frankly, it's a bit dull because the story is about diplomatic relations and a suitcase filled with a mini computer that people are arguing over stealing.
Yeah.
Compare that to what comes later with More Haste, Less Speed, where it is basically just a mixture of upper class and working class characters trying desperately to race across the English countryside to get hold of some what is it? That's printing plates.
Counterfeiting plates,
Counterfeiting plate. Yeah, exactly. So the way those two stories are told is so vastly different that I think it would have been a really difficult sell if the Secret Service had gone on in that direction, to have a story like A Case for the Bishop and a story like More Haste, Less Speed, and sort of trying to sell people, the first few episodes are a little bit boring, but don't worry, it gets more exciting later. It's kind of the same issue that Terrorhawks kind of runs into, arguably, depending on your opinion on Terrorhawks, is, well, the first few episodes don't really feel like what the rest of the series ends up at, but you do have to start at the beginning.
Sure.
And it's just a weird, it's a weird quirk of filmed TV series at that time, where they would make a whole batch of them and then broadcast them and get the response back. If the Secret Service had been, it could have, if the lead time hadn't been so great, where they could have made episodes of the Secret Service maybe a few months or possibly even a few weeks ahead of their broadcast, that would have been the potential for even a satirical edge on it could have been amazing. But unfortunately, it was produced in this bubble, and they didn't know what it was going to become later.
One of the factors in its failure, I guess, to kind of reach an audience was that they didn't really show it to a wide audience. They limited the number of regions that they distributed it to, which is kind of like a lack of faith from ITC.
Well, yes, that was obviously an issue, but it also would have been a choice of the individual ITV franchises, and kind of plays back into what you were talking about earlier, where it was like, well, we don't need a new Gerry Anderson Supermarionation show. We've already got so many of them. and that had started to creep in with Joe 90. Joe 90 got, was shown in
Less.
fewer regions, and so
Yeah.
it was a creeping problem. And so it's sort of why ultimately the argument of, well, the Secret Service should have continued for more episodes, really there was no need for it when it started, so there certainly wasn't any need for it. There wasn't a need for more of it by the time it finished.
Yeah,
so
I think what it would have taken would have been for if say hypothetically Lou Grade had been good pals with Peter Sellers,
right,
big star at the time.
Yeah,
perhaps Peter Sellers had kids who loved the Gerry Anderson shows. Let's say hypothetically, made up story,
very hypothetical. I'm excited to see where you go with this. Do continue.
Yeah. So Gerry Anderson, Gerry and Sylvia are looking to move on to pastures new, and they're getting ready to shutter the studio in order to turn it into basically the effects unit for UFO. Lay off all the puppeteers. Peter Sellers somehow gets wind of this and is like, I hear that this is closing. Maybe I should, go and pick up a toy for little Billy Sue or whatever his kids' names were.
Right.
And Peter Sellers goes to Lou and is like, yes, I hear that Jerry's getting out of the puppet business. And Lou's like, yes, that's right. And somehow he sees the Secret Service and he goes, that's kind of an interesting thing. And he agrees to finance a new series of the Secret Service,
right,
in like a Peter Sellers kind of style. So then it becomes like a totally different show, and then becomes a cult sensation, is sold to America, and becomes a great success. That's my alternate universe.
Wow.
What I would like to have happened to the Secret Service. Totally implausible. I know you're going to pick holes in this thing.
I could pick so many holes in it. I mean, you are thinking big, but weirder things have happened. So I'm not going to say totally impossible. But like the Secret Service itself, I mean, I don't. It's so again, because that Century 21 style of filmmaking and the way those stories were written are so ingrained in me at this point. I can't foresee Supermarionation being written by anyone else, or done in a different way to anyone else. It totally could have been. You totally could have kept those puppeteers working on episodes of the Secret Service or a show like the Secret Service, and written it in a different way. That being said, we're talking about it would be great if a different set of writers came in. I mean, Tony Barwick really grabs the bull by the horns. I think that's an important distinction to make as well. The version of the Secret Service that we start with, written by Gerry and Sylvia in the first episode, is very different to what Tony Barwick is doing once he is script editor, and he is basically in full control of all the scripts by that point. And what he's doing is akin to what he then later did on Terrorhawks, which is just throwing crazy stuff at the wall. So I think the problem with sorry, go ahead.
It's interesting to consider these alternate, like you say, we as fans, I think, get into this mode where we're used to thinking about the production company in one way, that style that was like their signature house style. But they also had, a commercial production company for making commercials. There's all these like alternative routes that came to light through research that Stephen LaRiviere did for his book on Filmed in Supermarionation. All these alternate routes that the company almost went down. Stuff with like his partnership with Nicholas Parsons, where they were talking about making other films together. Whole other branches and other wings could have come and gone, or things like later on in the 70s. I mean, Gerry wrote a sitcom pilot, which is not super well known. So, all this stuff that like could have happened. I think the Secret Service could have been part of that, expansion into other areas. Yeah. But sadly,
I mean, the really simple version of it is people the way it could have run, and the way that the certainly the puppet stage at Century 21 argued was, well, Gerry and Sylvia and everyone who wants to go off and make live action productions, you go ahead, you go off and do that. We'll mind the store here and keep making the Secret Service or other Supermarionation productions. Arguably, that had already been happening. That had already been the case where, Gerry and Sylvia basically turned in the first script for the Secret Service, and then by and large were off doing, I think Doppelganger had already happened at that point. They were certainly, I think it's almost certain that UFO and things like it were being developed while the Secret Service was shooting and in production. So it's sort of it was all a planned transition. Might not have come across to the puppeteers that way. Because the last thing you're going to tell someone is, oh, by the way, when this job you've had for the past 10 years quite comfortably, we're planning on shutting that down. So it probably came across to some people as quite a shock, but I think it was probably higher up. It was definitely being thought about. The writing was on the wall, as they say. So what would you specifically, when it comes to thinking about future episodes of the Secret Service, had the series continued, what sort of exploits would you have liked to have seen certain characters get involved with? Would you envision newer characters turning up, or maybe some other characters maybe disappearing, perhaps? I don't know. What is there anything specific that comes to mind in terms of a direction for the show?
I think it needed a main antagonist to kind of give it some more punch. I think the episode that comes closest to that, there's a rival school for spies there.
The episode is called School for Spies.
And it's another parish of
well, it's fascinating, that episode, because you have the main villain, which is the Archdeacon, and it's played beautifully, where you don't see his face for a long time, and it's very pointed, like the way it's being told. It always feels like a sort of a bit of a like the Batman TV series in the way that that's played. It's
I think it needed something like that to give it more surrealism and more of that kind of zaniness. That kind of, and I think an antagonist could have driven that energy for sure. A wacky, like 60s Batman type of antagonist.
That's it. It's kind of wacky. It's like not of the real world. Like a character like the Archdeacon, who's like a villain modeled after the priesthood, is kind of like, well, that would never happen in real life. But towards the end of the Secret Service, that sort of more surreal stuff starts to happen, which wasn't there to start with. It's like when you consider the first episode of UFO, the villain is an ambassador of Dreisenberg. It's like so dry and all very realistic, all very one note. Whereas, later episodes like School for Spies suddenly starts to go, what if, we've got this hero who's a priest. What if we had a villain who was also a priest? What if we had a whole gang of villains that was also a set of priests? And if it had been, I mean, you could have gone down some really bizarre avenues, which the Secret Service is very careful to avoid, where you could have had sort of a Catholics versus Protestants type of situation going on. You could have leaned into the religious imagery a lot more in that situation, but they didn't do it.
1969? Wow.
Yeah, that would have been pretty extreme, but it's like, well, that's an avenue they could have gone down, and they wouldn't have been in very good taste if they had done that. But, who knows?
It's insane to think about. That's like the Secret Service as directed by.
That would have been extraordinary.
Really bizarre. Yeah, no, I would have loved to seen that. I would love to see more minimizer type stories of exploring, like maybe somebody steals the minimizer. What sort of chaos, Ant-Man style chaos would have ensued. A chase with the minimizer.
Well, again, you have this extraordinary surreal device that obviously would never really function in the real world. But it's used purely as a tool in the first few episodes, and it isn't dwelled upon how it works or what's going on with it or where it even came from. Is only very, very minimally touched upon.
Yeah.
You can imagine in later episodes they would have explored the full potential of having a shrinking ray, and they start to do that in things like More Haste Less Speed, where it's like, okay, we're going to miniaturize not only Matthew but also Father Unwin and also the car. Lovely Gabriel there. That had a lot of potential, where it's like, okay, we're not just going to shrink one of the characters to serve a purpose. Yeah. We'll shrink everyone and kind of have that sort of story. Just more of that little miniature people exploring a live action setting, I feel like was the direction that certainly Tony Barwick seemed like he wanted to take it in.
Yeah.
So that would have worked quite well. I'm trying to think.
Any other ideas to?
I mean, the thing that gets left unresolved, which I don't think ever would have been resolved, but it would have been nice to know a little bit more about why Mrs. Appleby detests Matthew so much. And maybe you could have had a story where, I don't know. Okay, here's what I would have liked to have happened actually in future episodes is Mrs. Appleby gets in on the secret. I don't think it was. I think it was really difficult to sustain having Mrs. Appleby, the housekeeper, be completely in the dark about what Father Unwin and Matthew are up to. And I think it would have been nice. She could have been more of like talking about Batman again, talking about an Alfred type figure.
Yeah.
Where she's just kind of pulling the strings on her end to try and keep everything at the vicarage looking normal to outsiders, when really she's in there helping to coordinate operations in her own baffling way. That could have had a lot of potential to it. I think.
Yeah. She could have been more of an Alfred. Yeah, I think that's a good idea, and it would have been nice to, because there was kind of, I mean, with Joe 92, that kind of like female.
Yeah, having that female touch is missing.
Housekeeper trope.
Yeah. We had
absolutely.
a short moment where you dropped in and out of the stream there. Sorry about that. What we were going to say was, yeah, it's weird. It's happened a couple of times now. Let's see. Yes, you're talking about having a female presence in the show, and how Mrs. Appleby could have offered that in her own unique way.
Absolutely.
That would have been very, very special.
I want to say there was a story in the annual or else a comic that gave a little bit more background into why Mrs. Appleby hated Matthew so much.
Interesting.
But
was this the more recent annual that Fanderson published? Because there wasn't a Secret Service annual produced at the time, that's for sure. There was the VIP
it's just a hazy
story, but otherwise not much.
Yeah, this is just a hazy memory that I have, and I can't be specific about it because I don't recall. But I'm definitely
Ben's making up stories in his head again.
Oh dear. Not again.
Making up your own lore about how things worked or didn't work.
Well, it's funny if that is the case, because I don't actually have a specific memory of what that was.
I think you're imagining things again, Ben. I think you are. Right. But I think that more or less wraps up our discussion about the Secret Service. It would be lovely to hear from viewers about whether they would have liked to have seen the Secret Service continue, or whether maybe 13 episodes was enough and everyone was quite happy with them moving on to UFO and other things. Definitely two ways of looking at it. You can email us at sec.hazard.pod@gmail.com with any of your emails, any of your thoughts and feelings about anything Gerry Anderson related. We would love to hear them. Otherwise, I think we're ready to go. I think that wraps up this episode. Don't you think, Ben? Any final thoughts?
I think we did it. Thanks very much. Don't forget to subscribe. If you like the show, you can get it wherever you get your podcasts. You can subscribe to Jack here on YouTube. We very much appreciate that. If you want to support us, Jack has a lovely Ko-Fi page set up which you can find in the description below. That is very much appreciated if you can support us in that way. But if not, just click that little subscribe button, and that means so much to us.
Yeah.
Jack, where can people find you on social
Well,
media?
the best place to go is securityhazard.net. That's the Security Hazard blog where I write all my articles. As I say, coming soon. Big Space Precinct reviews are going to be happening pretty soon, but you can also find all my social media links on there and things like that. But yeah, definitely a place to go, securityhazard.net. Ben, how about you? Where can people find you?
At Supermarionation on Twitter, Ben Wolf Page on Blue Sky. Where else? Supermarionation on Facebook, Supermarionation on YouTube. Please do subscribe to me there as well. You'll be able to see things like the short film that Jack and I made the other weekend. That's coming out very soon.
Yeah,
on the Supermarionation YouTube channel.
Very excited to that. You get to see whether these guys who spend all their time talking about puppet films can actually make a puppet film.
Yeah, see what they're really made of.
Yeah. Bearing in mind we only made it in 48 hours as part of a film challenge.
Oh,
so,
yeah.
You know,
Sure.
enormous caveats to that. But otherwise, thank you very much for watching, and we will see you next week. And actually, I could give you a bit of a tease about next week, because we're going to be joined by a special guest, aren't we, Mr. Ben? Who's joining us?
Ooh, can we reveal it? Can we reveal who our special guest is?
I think we can. Yeah. It is
pull back the curtain and reveal Mr. Andrew Clements.
Andrew Clements. I'm sure nobody's surprised at all because he's worked so closely with Security Hazard in the past. But yes, Andrew Clements is joining us as a special guest for next week's episode, where we will be very special topic. We will be reviewing the feature film Agent Crush, and this was Andrew's choice. I've never seen it before. Ben, have you seen it before?
I have seen
it before. So I'm going to have to do my research, learn about it, but we'll get to hear what Mr. Andrew Clements thinks of it, and you get to hear what we think about it in next week's episode. So you can tune in live Wednesdays, 6 p.m. here on YouTube, or you can catch us later on any of your podcast apps of choice. But for now, thank you very much for watching, everyone, and we will see you next week. Bye, everyone.
Bye.